So Chris Gunness is many things, but he's here because he's the former spokesperson for the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA. And I'm very grateful that he's here with me because UNRWA has been one of the prime targets for the Israeli propaganda machine concerning basically the state of humanitarian distribution in Gaza, and that has been the cornerstone of the attacks and the reconstruction of this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that has served essentially to the further execution and victimization of the Palestinian population. So, Chris, thank you very much for your time.
Martin, it's a pleasure and an honor. I'm very happy to chat to you. Thank you.
So about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think maybe less, you gave an interview in which you referred to the October the 7th sort of, I would say, almost onslaught of talking points that emerged or that came out of Jerusalem concerning Gaza, concerning the attacks of the 7th of October, and then, of course, also concerning the agency and concerning Hamas. And you were quite, you made some very poignant claims, particularly the fact that there was this sort of state of tension that was built around the things that were said. Importantly, you pointed out with no evidence and really just as far as we now know, I think with complete certainty, fabrications in many cases, and in many other cases, just, bare claims.
So, Martin, that is indeed a very good question. And for me, we go back not just from October the 7th, 2023, but back through all the Gaza assaults by Israel that I worked for UNRWA through. And what happened in 2014, for example, it also happened rather brilliantly from the perspective of the Israelis in the October attack, is that within hours, Israel had its talking points to all of its spokespeople around the world. These are spokespeople in Netanyahu's office, in the foreign ministry, ambassadors all around the world, military spokespeople, civilian spokespeople everywhere. And those talking points were essentially, this was a surprise attack. It came from nowhere. It had no context at all. And Israel had the overwhelming right to use any means to defend itself. And of course, none of those things are true. The context, there was a long context. It wasn't a surprise attack. There's evidence that Egyptian and Israeli intelligence knew very well what was going to happen. It's the most advanced intelligence community on the planet. So of course they know. So it wasn't a surprise attack. It did have a context. The context was the dispossession of the Palestinians in 1948, the occupation, which began in 1967, the blockade of Gaza, which began in 2007, and the collective punishment that has continued ever since. So that's the second talking point that was completely wrong. And the other talking point is that Israel had the right to use any means to defend itself. Now, no one is disputing that Israel has the right to defend itself, especially in response to condemnable attacks of the sort we saw, and everyone was very quick to defend, to condemn the attacks. And that was one of the Israeli talking points, by the way: ask whoever interviews you to condemn the attacks. That was also very much out there, and that went round to all broadcasters as well. As people were appearing in broadcast stations, that was the first thing they said. The other really important talking point was this idea that Hamas butchered 1,400 people, which was later revised downwards to 1,200. And that is because Israel invoked, as has been very well investigated by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, that the Hannibal Directive was invoked in 3 places by the Israeli army. Now, the Hannibal Directive essentially says that when Israelis are being kidnapped, the army is to kill everyone, to kill all the people doing the kidnapping. And if that means killing those being kidnapped, then so be it. So that's why we saw pictures of huge amounts of vehicles completely torched and completely destroyed, because they were, so the Haaretz investigation, I think quite conclusively, convincingly shows that there were these disproportionate attacks which didn't distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, because Israel didn't want to be in a situation which it's found itself in, and it's been a huge political headache for Netanyahu ever since, of having dozens and dozens of Israeli hostages being held with Hamas. So, you know, those talking points all got out. Israel established its narrative pretty much within the first 48 hours of the onslaught beginning. And everyone else, including UNRWA, the UN, governments around the world, everybody was playing catch up. But it was Israel that very brilliantly set the agenda in the first period of the assault.
Hey, let me share an intuition that I had very early on with you, and perhaps you can comment on it. I got a call on the 9th from a friend who, in the first part of the conversation, a Jewish friend who I grew up with, went to the same school. One of the first things that she said was, she mentioned the 40 decapitated babies. And at that point, she mentioned also a pregnant woman that had been disemboweled and the fetus placed supposedly next to her. Both of these things were shown to be completely false in the weeks, I think, not even months, but weeks.
And the babies trumpeted, of course, by Biden himself.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, the White House had to pull back, but the first impression that I had, and that was actually the beginning of a breakup of a 40-year friendship. And the main reason was because my reaction was, I'd been in journalism for a very long time. This to me sounds like a tall tale. And there were many reasons why I felt that that was the case. I mean, of course, I didn't emit a judgment. I went out and I looked up, and then my suspicions were confirmed. But here is the point I want to make. I had a very strong sense that there was the creation of a state of tension, and that state of tension had an aim. I couldn't quite tell what the aim of that state of tension was. But today, looking back, I have the sense that a lot of what was to come was already in the cards, was already laid out on the table. So it was anything that, if anybody were to come to me and say that 40 babies in my village have been beheaded, I would be expected probably to have the kind of reaction that the Israeli public had.
There's a lot to say there. First of all, we have a situation where the well-documented beheading of babies and the complete dismemberment and blowing to pieces of babies in Gaza, hardly, all of which are well documented, hardly gets very much news these days. I mean, there are general reportage, and I think most of the media have been very good in keeping Gaza up in the headlines. But whereas a completely fake story about babies being beheaded, etc., was trumpeted around the world as the gospel truth and went everywhere, the situation of babies in Gaza now is just, if ever, more than 5 or 6 seconds in the news. But I think what you say about the ground being set for what was to come is absolutely true. Now, let us not forget, as was submitted in the deposition by the South Africans at the International Court of Justice in its genocide case, Mr. Netanyahu invoked the biblical genocide of Amalek within a few weeks of this. Now, just to remind your listeners, in the book of Samuel, God instructs the kings, the prophets, to commit genocide against the Amalek people. And he says, spare nobody, no women, no children, no babies, no suckling children, kill all the animals, destroy their food production, destroy everything. And in the ICJ South African deposition, they played Netanyahu saying this in video. Do not forget Amalek, he said. This is the man who was effectively not officially, but effectively the commander-in-chief of the army. And then they cut to soldiers on the ground dancing in circles, joyfully and gleefully and proudly, singing and chanting about the Amalek genocide. So here you had the commander-in-chief effectively and the soldiers on the ground who he is commanding, carrying out that genocide as they proudly pushed the button. And you saw in the background a huge apartment block blown to pieces. So it was very clear to anyone watching early on that there was genocidal intent. And that's important when we come to talk about accountability and the ICJ process. But he was not the only one. Itzhak Herzog, the the president of Israel, again, who was quoted in the ICJ ruling of the 26th of January last year, dehumanizing the Palestinians and saying they're all aware civilians. There's no distinction effectively is what he was saying, which was seen as a genocidal justification of collective punishment. And Yoav Gallant, when he announced that nothing would be allowed into Gaza, no food, no electricity, no water, no nothing, again made very dehumanizing comments, which were quoted in the genocide case. And indeed, if you look at the UN Commission of Inquiry into Gaza, which was published just this week, you saw again those three men being quoted. But of course, there were many more Israeli officials and Israeli journalists who are guilty of inciting genocide. And to be very clear, the Genocide Convention is called the genocide. It's on the prevention as well as the punishment of genocide. So if you incite genocide, you've violated the convention. You're guilty of genocide because you are inciting, i.e. failing to prevent genocide. But to come back to your question and your intuition that these stories about beheaded babies, etc., were presaging something more sinister, I think you're right. I think that once the Israeli public have been whipped up into a sense of ultimate outrage, and that's another thing about genocide, which Raphael Lemkin, the man who coined the phrase, the word genocide, was very clear. It's on a continuum. It's not a one-off action. And one of the things that has to happen in this continuum, this genocidal continuum, is that the public has to be prepared. Israelis are fundamentally decent human beings. And if you're going to persuade that population to commit a genocide against your neighbors, you have to convince them that these are people who are not people. You have to dehumanize them. You have to convince them that they're all people who want to come and get you. They'll murder your babies. They're so barbaric. So it was part of the creation of a narrative. I talked earlier about getting the talking points out. The next phase was creating that narrative, which enabled genocide. And that's very, very much what was going on. And that's why I think your intuition, which you describe, which I'm very sad to hear it broke up a 40-year friendship. It's sad to think of any friendship not being able to somehow, come closer together because these things are so terrible. And ultimately, it's people coming together that is going to set Palestine on the path to freedom and justice. So I'm sorry to hear that. But I think your instincts and your intuition, sadly, were absolutely well-founded.
I think it's a price that I'm seeing people pay, so to say. I mean, if it can be considered a price across the board. But I mean, I think that, we are divided by the horror, I suppose. There are some of us who cannot live with it, and some of us that have learned strategies to either tolerate it, in some cases even applaud it. I was going to say that one of the things that still strikes me about the discourse concerning Palestinians and dehumanization is this sort of repetition of the talking point of Golda Meir, right? Which is that we will never forgive them for making us
shoot their children.
And what I find really remarkable about it, I mean, is that this is not really just the animalization of the Palestinian, right? Any animal takes care of its pup. Any animal takes care of its young. So the Palestinians are even below that. They don't reach the threshold of every other animal that will actually care for its young. They would actually put them to die. And I find that the repetition of that trope really incredible. First of all, incredible on its own merit, but then remarkable that this is something that actually gets sort of spread, not just in the Israeli space, sort of in the Israeli discussion, but across the board. I mean, if you listen to media in the US, if you listen to media in the UK, especially sort of very much Israeli-aligned media, Latin America, I mean, Argentina, where I come from, is constant. This idea that the Palestinians are putting their children, sacrificing their children to be able to show the world, the Israelis under one light or other, it's rather remarkable.
Yes, I mean, the bestialization of the Palestinians is something which has been going on for a very long time. And I think Golda Meir's comment, though, was referring to something maybe slightly different, which was that it refocuses the attention back on the suffering of the oppressor. It's her saying, this is damaging us. We feel so sad about having to kill your children. I mean, apart from today, it's hard to see how that's true. It seems to me if you look at Israeli social media and you read Israeli opinion polls, there's no real regret for what is happening. I mean, I have friends, family friends, who are extraordinarily brave in that they are being victimized and demonized and stigmatized by their own communities for daring to go out onto the streets and not just call for the hostages to come home, but to call for freedom, dignity, rights, justice, self-determination for the Palestinians. So I don't wish to dismiss the entire population of Israel with these comments, but nonetheless, I think that one of the reasons why I think Golda Meir's comment doesn't resonate very much today is that what she's trying to say is we feel so bad about having to do these bad things. And actually, I think that many Israelis now are convinced of the rectitude of the genocide. They wouldn't describe it as genocide, but they feel that a strong Israel, as Mr. Netanyahu said, it needs to behave like Sparta. It needs to be a warrior nation that will forever be defending its people and has a God-given justification for doing that. Its economy must be geared towards national self-defense, not the kind of prosperity that many of my Jewish friends thought that they were going back to Israel to engender.
This is a very, very old trope in Zionism. And I mean, it comes from the very construction of the Hebrew as opposed to the Jew, which is actually a central topic in both Herzl and Jabotinsky and Gordon and so on. I mean, it's very visible and very troubling for those of us who belong to another line of Jewish
I mean,
thought.
the other thing to say about this is that I think that relates to the talking points question is that if you go back to the very first administrations, Levi Eshkol, for example, who was the prime minister of Israel at the very start of the occupation, there has always been this bifurcated public advocacy. On the one hand, Levi Eshkol was saying to the international community, we want peace with the Egyptians, we want peace with the Jordanians, and indeed those things came. But he was also at the same time green-lighting illegal expansion of Jewish settlements in occupied Palestinian land. And that's very much part of what's been going on ever since. On the one hand, the talking points go out, pity us, feel sorry for us. We're being forced to defend ourselves in these ways. We never wanted to do this. And on the other hand, what Zionism is doing is giving Zionist administrations, is giving the green light to expel Palestinians from their home. And this slightly kind of sleight of hand, which has been going on, has now come out into the open, whereas in previous administrations, Israel spoke out of the two corners of its mouth, often in Hebrew, saying, we're going to go and get the land, don't worry, Zionism is safe with us. And in English to the international community, they'd be saying, well, we want peace, we back a two-state solution, But if you look at what was going on from 1948 until Israel was forced almost into Oslo, this was going on and it carried on since. But the Israeli plan has been made abundantly clear because you've now got Smotrich and Ben Gvir and Netanyahu saying very openly, we do not want the Palestinians to have a state and we're going to annex all of Palestine. And the Americans, as we saw from Rubio, who, from what we can see, was in Israel recently giving a green light for the destruction of Gaza City, I'm sure there would have been a lot of discussion about America also giving its tacit and often not very tacit approval for the wholesale annexation of the West Bank.
I wanted to ask you before I want to turn very, very briefly to 2023 before October 7th, because it was a brutal year. I mean, particularly in the West Bank for the Palestinians, but also in Gaza. There was a bombing in Gaza in mid-May. There were sort of different forms of violence exercised. And one of the things that people tend to forget, it was the year in which pretty much the status quo principle around Al-Aqsa more or less came to an end, because there were like regular visits by Jewish groups, I mean extremist groups and settlers to pray in the campus of Al-Aqsa, which was actually forbidden essentially. So I wonder if you can talk a bit about 2023 in Palestinian. Palestinian life.
I mean, it sort of set the stage really for what was going to happen in October, because as you said, particularly Al-Aqsa. And I think it's really important to understand from a Gazan mentality, if you have lived in Gaza and you're deeply religious, for you, Al-Aqsa has this profound meaning. It's not even symbolism. It's not symbolic. It's real. It's substantial. It's substantive. And so to see these Israeli right-wing religious settlers going into a place which is entirely sacred, think of the most holy shrines of Christianity, think of the most holy shrines of Buddhism, of Jainism, of Sikhism. One thinks of Mrs. Gandhi sending in the troops into the Golden Temple in Punjab, in Amritsar, which eventually, of course, led to her assassination and indeed the assassination of her son. I mean, these things, religious capitals and religious buildings at the center of those capitals have huge significance. And so what you saw in 2023 was a real sense of outrage as Israeli ministers and Israeli settler leaders led these vicious marches on, and to be, people don't know the geography of Jerusalem. To get to Al-Aqsa, you have to go through these very narrow lanes of occupied Jerusalem, where, since 1967, the Palestinians have suffered the indignity of having occupying soldiers in their capital cities and around their most holy shrines. So this was setting the seal of a humiliation that had first begun in 1967. So tensions were high. The other background, I think, to 2023, which is important for your listeners to grasp, to understand what was happening, is that the Abraham Accords were continuing apace. Now, the Abraham Accords are a process of normalization between Israel and its Arab neighbors, which the Trump administration was really pushing. And essentially, it turns on its head the concept of land for peace. So resolutions 242 and 338, and indeed all of international law, for example, the international law that prevents Putin from just invading Ukraine and taking land by force. It's enshrined in the UN Charter and international law that the acquisition of land by force is completely unacceptable and illegal. And there's, in Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, there are enforcement provisions for allowing those aggressions to be forced back. So it's very much enshrined in international law. But what you had was the Americans and the Israelis saying to the Arabs, you can have peace without land. In other words, you can have peace with Israel without the Palestinians having to give up occupied land. And for the Palestinians, that was a red line, because they were being thrown under the bus through the Abraham Accords. America was saying to Israel, you do peace with your Arab neighbors, we'll sort out the pesky Palestinians, don't worry. And one of the things, I think, in the background to this Hamas attack was that this all had to be put on the front page of all the newspapers. It had to be established as an item in the international discourse and part of the international peacemaking agenda. And so that was also going on in 2023. And the other thing that happened actually just before the October incidents was that the Israelis attacked and killed some Islamic Jihad leaders inside Gaza. And Hamas did not respond as it normally would do by firing rockets into Israel. But Islamic Jihad did, and the Israelis knew that. And that sent a signal, I think, to the Israelis that Hamas was perhaps interested in some kind of economic liberalization, lifting of the blockade a bit so that there could be some trading. Hamas businessmen would be enriched a little. So that sent a signal from Hamas that maybe they were interested in peace. And in fact, what it appears now they were planning was the attack in October, though I think that Hamas didn't realize there was going to be a music festival full of young people and others they could kidnap and take as hostages. So it was a very eventful year, but there were all these things going on in the background, I think, which added and really helps to explain the enormity of what actually happened.
What I find most remarkable about a lot of this story that you tell, or that we're just discussing, is the fact that when the claim is repeated that everything started on October the 7th, it's not that you need to go back to 1947 or 1948. You can just look at
Yeah,
the record for 2023 and
yeah,
basically see why is it that this thing was called Al-Aqsa flood, because it
yes,
was a direct
yes.
reference to exactly what the context was. So
Mm.
it really talks to your point about the success of deploying the talking points by the Israelis. I wanted to ask you, and I know we have little time, but we still have about 10 minutes, about UNRWA and the way that the Israelis essentially proceeded in the dismantling of the operation of the agency on land. I think that now it is very clear what was the intention behind that, which was basically controlling the movement of food minimally, using food as an instrument in the operations. But what is your sense of how this unfolded?
Well, to be very clear, Israel's attack on UNRWA has actually been going on since 1967. It was very soon after the occupation began that the Israeli authorities were complaining to UNRWA that its textbooks didn't sufficiently reflect the narrative of the occupying power, the definition of chutzpah, you might say. But so Israel has always had a problem with UNRWA. It believes falsely that if they can get rid of UNRWA, then the 6 million plus refugees that UNRWA serves will somehow be magicked and airbrushed out of the discourse. And with that removal of the Palestinians, you're also removing their right of return. Israel believes that if they all came back, it would destroy the Jewish character of the state. And therefore, UNRWA is frankly trying to do what Hitler tried to do, which destroy Jews, 6 million of them. Of course, that's nonsense. UNRWA believes, as do I, and as do most people who understand international refugee law, would say that refugees classically have three choices. They have the choice of local integration, i.e., be assimilated where you are. They have the right of return to their homes in accordance with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in accordance with United Nations Resolution 194. And they have the right to third country resettlements. If you persuade, I don't know, Canada or Argentina or somewhere to take you and give you a visa, great, off you go. But that is something which only the refugees can decide, and they have to make those choices as a matter of free will. So Israel's saying to people, go away. That does not constitute leaving for third country resettlement of your own free will. So there's that big political game which Israel was playing, which was basically to get rid of the refugees and their right of return. And there was also the question of UNRWA's neutrality. Now, to be clear, UNRWA, according to the Kelowna report, this is a report established after the accusations from Israel that 12 UNRWA staff had taken part in the October attacks. Madame Kelowna, a former French foreign minister, was very clear, excuse me, that of all the UN agencies, and she looked at WFP and World Health Organization and OCHA and all of them, it was her view that UNRWA had the most watertight and the most reliable neutrality frameworks and provisions for vetting their staff. And one of those is that UNRWA, we used to hand over to the Israelis the names of and digitally, the names of every single one of UNRWA staff, more than 30,000 staff. So for years, Israel had the right to check and to investigate as many staff as it wanted to. Not once did it complain about UNRWA staff until the October attacks happened. And then they said, oh, there are 12 UNRWA workers. Now, the Kelowna report, an external evaluation investigation looked into it, and so did an internal UN report. And when the Kelowna report came out, she was very clear. Israel provided no evidence whatsoever to substantiate its claims, its false claims, that UNRWA staff had taken part in the attacks. Neither did the internal investigation. But this was typical. Israel was able to get its accusations out in advance of everybody, plastered across newspapers, including the New York Times, all around the world. Some newspapers, like The Guardian, like Channel 4 News in the UK, did the right thing, were responsible journalists. But, you know, when UNRWA sacks the workers, that is a fact in the real world, which people can, mainstream media and others, whether they're sympathetic or not to Israel or the Palestinians, that is a fact that people can report. And it was reported. And a lot of donors, more than 15, got frightened and just defunded UNRWA. And Israel then followed up by passing two pieces of legislation through the Knesset, which made illegal Israelis having contact with UNRWA, which was designated as a terrorist organization, which, of course, none of this was true. I called it the mother of all lies almost straight away, because I remember whenever there were any problems, donors would raise with us questions of staff neutrality where we felt that there were credible reports. I mean, UNRWA's job was to do humanitarian and development assistance to 6 million people. So we couldn't have all of our work taken up with investigating false claims. But where there were credible claims, we always investigated. And when wrongdoing was found, the staff member concerned was always disciplined up to and including dismissal from the agency, which, by the way, in Gaza, not having an UNRWA salary means you and your family fall below the poverty line. So it's really a very serious thing for UNRWA to do this. But we did it to the satisfaction of our donors, all of whom funded us to the tune of approximately, depending on the year, $1.2 billion a year. So if there were any suggestions that Israel's claims were correct, do you really think the world community, including the US, the EU, the Germans, the Brits, all others, would be funding UNRWA to the tune of 1.2 billion? It was a nonsense, but Israel got its narrative out there. It was followed up by a lot of bullying. I mean, there's been a McCarthyite witch hunt, frankly, a global one against UNRWA. And, the agency simply doesn't have the kind of resources. I mean, there have been reports of the Israeli Ministry of Hasbara, I don't know what it is in Hebrew, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on social media attacks on UNRWA. So if you type in UNRWA to Google, it goes to an Israeli government website, which basically says that UNRWA is up to its neck in terrorism and is in cahoots with Hamas, etc. So, I really feel desperately sorry for UNRWA because it's got the sort of full propaganda machinery of the international Zionist movement arraigned against it. And I can tell you, as someone who's in charge of communications at UNRWA's budget, I can tell you, is tiny in comparison.
And yet the Israelis, by a very large margin, I mean, as far as one can tell from public deliberation and the way that things are moving in different public spheres, seems to really have, if not lost, seem to have been sort of severely degraded in public discourse.
I think you're right. I mean, I think we're at a genuine turning point now. I think, America aside, and that's a big aside because of its huge, $3.8 billion worth a year of military support. So America is a huge player. But I do think that things have turned. We had the cases at the ICJ, where it's very clear that the court believes that there is a plausible case of genocide to answer, and they've given Israel provisional measures to implement, none of which Israel is implementing at all, which is going to only increase and strengthen the case when the ICJ eventually, and it'll probably be years, comes out with a decision on whether Israel is committing genocide. However, the publication just recently of the UN Commission of Inquiry report, it's very interesting to me. They very cleverly, Chris Sidoti and Navi Pillay, they very cleverly use the analysis based on the Genocide Convention. So they were effectively sending a signal to the International Court of Justice. We are going to do all of your fact finding. We'll get all the data together. We'll analyze the data according to 4 of the provisions in the Genocide Convention. So deliberately killing people, causing harm, both mental and physical, creating conditions of life, number 3, that against the group in whole or in part, and then the provisions against to protect babies and young people. And so it looked at the destruction of maternity clinics, fertility treatment. It looked at mental health causing harm, looked at the number of deaths. The analysis was very cleverly and carefully aligned with the Genocide Convention. It also looked at one very important part of the Genocide Convention, which is intent. You have to show not only that these things are happening, but they're happening not because Israel wants to ethnically cleanse, not because Israel wants to commit war crimes, but because Israel is intentionally causing genocide, is violating the Genocide Convention. And that was done as well. As I said earlier in this interview, Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, and Yitzhak Herzog are very clearly shown as expressing genocidal intent. So that's the ICJ. You've also got, of course, the case at the ICC, which has issued an arrest warrant against Netanyahu. They've only chosen one thing to get him for, but there are plenty of others they could have chosen, and that was for the crime of deliberately using starvation as a weapon of war. And again, in the UNCOI, it's an independent report, I hasten to add, but it was commissioned by the Human Rights Council. It was very clear that starvation is being used as a weapon of war, and it's systematic. That's, I think, widespread and systematic. In other words, it's from the top, it's got intention involved, and it's widespread and systematic, and it's genocidal. All that was proven. And then, of course, on top of that, you've got all these cases. Hind Rajab Foundation is one I would point to, who very cleverly analyzed social media postings of Israeli soldiers proudly blowing up and killing civilians and marauding and stealing from their homes, and all that sort of stuff is going on online. And so Hind Rajab and other groups, but then principally, have been looking at individual criminal responsibility. And when people boast on their Facebook pages, they're just off to Amsterdam for a fun weekend or whatever, Hind Rajab then go to the prosecuting authorities in whichever country and say, here's a criminal file. They're arriving on Thursday in a flight from Tel Aviv. Would you please arrest them? And so, there's a lot of this accountability work, but that gives journalists and others a chance, a sort of news peg to focus on the real stories and the real images and the real videos coming out of Gaza, which show starving babies. Well over 100, if not more, babies have starved to death. The figure is probably much higher. Well over 60,000 people have been killed, and that's not counting all the people lying under the rubble who've not been verified and confirmed dead. Every university in Gaza has been destroyed, water desalination plants, electricity plants. When I first went to Gaza, there were orange and olive groves in the north you drove through. Those have all been completely flattened by bombs. What wasn't left after 2014 was simply bulldozed by Israeli armored military bulldozers. Civilian life has been completely eradicated. 92% of the housing stock has gone. People are being forced into what Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister, describes as a concentration camp in the south. It gives, we all now know what's going on, and this work that's being done on accountability and reports coming out, this gives journalists a chance to return time and time to the story and reflect on what's going on. And I think, at the level of the people, we've won. The people of the world, particularly the global majority, what used to be called the global south, are very well aware of what Israel is doing. And this is now filtering up to the level of governments, because I think governments instinctively, Keir Starmer himself said, I'm an unconditional supporter of Zionism. But I think in spite of that, people like Keir Starmer are being forced by action on the streets of the UK, action of unions, actions of many other sorts that are going on in this country, campaigns to disrupt and to get people to start asking their bosses, are you asking me, as a civil servant dealing with a defense contract for Israel, am I violating international law? Could I be held criminally accountable? Those sorts of disruptive campaigns are now being, very much sort of pushed. So I think governments are now being forced. And I think when you've got Netanyahu standing up and saying to the people of Israel, we're the next Sparta, I think within Israel, he's really losing the argument. I think there are many people who are now saying, we don't want to live in a state that's, whose economy is dedicated to feeding a war machine, which keeps Netanyahu in power. So I think at all levels, both internally within Israel, the tide is really turning. I still think that the religious right have got their hands on the Knesset, and it's going to take an awful lot to dislodge Netanyahu and his coalition. But I think in the world of public opinion globally, I think the tide is really turning. I think we will see the major countries in the world, major inverted commas, recognize Palestine. I think Israel will be ejected, as apartheid South Africa was, from the UN General Assembly. And I think we're going to see Israel, if not already, turn into a pariah state. And what happens the way no pariah states survive for eternity. And I think Israel, as we now know it, will not exist. I don't know quite when, but if you look at the works of someone like Ilan Pappé, the Israeli scholar who's now at Exeter University, he certainly is of the belief that Zionism's days are numbered.
Chris, I want to thank you for your kindness, your words,
It's a pleasure.
Your time.